welcome and good afternoon. My name is Ian Cornelius. I'm the current Edward Surtz Professor in the Department of English at Loyola University of Chicago. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 44th Annual Edward L. Surtz Lecture in the Humanities. This annual endowed lecture honors the memory and scholarship of Father Edward L. Surtz, S.J., a beloved member of the Loyola faculty and a distinguished scholar of Renaissance humanism, best known for his work on Thomas More's Utopia. Edward Surtz's his work was multidisciplinary, like the humanists whom he studied. The lectures that we hold in his memory aim to emulate that multidisciplinary breadth, and accordingly, it's a special pleasure today to acknowledge the many co-sponsors of this year's lecture. This lecture would not have been possible without generous support from the John Cardinal Cody Endowed Chair in Theology, the Joan and Bill Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Department of Theology, and the Department of English. Special thanks to my colleagues David Chinitz, Michael Murphy, Edmondo Lupieri, and Robert DeVito for their support for and their collaboration in this event. I thank Randy Newman for his help in planning this event and bringing it to fruition. And I thank the members of the Surtz Lecture Committee, Melissa Bradshaw, Erica Christie, Julia Elsky, Jeff Glover, Niev McGuigan, Ren Romero, Diane Rothleiter, Emily Sherratt, and Olivia Stewart-Lester. In recent years, the Surtz Committee has held a writing contest in anticipation of the year's lecture. This year, we asked current Loyola undergraduates to retell the story of Noah and the flood from Genesis for the era of climate change. I'm pleased to award a copy of Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible to Jeffrey Lillard in recognition of his entry into this contest. Jeffrey, are you here? Here's Jeffrey. Come on up. Jeffrey, these books are yours. Read them well.
Yeah, please, I appreciate it.
Finally, it's a pleasure to thank Thomas Regan, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and of the Graduate School, for his robust and spirited support for the Surtz Lecture and for the humanities more broadly at Loyola. I now invite Dean Regan to provide some words of welcome and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. One of the nicer aspects of being Dean of the College is that I am frequently given the humbling opportunity to speak on behalf of the entire Loyola University community, a word of official greeting to the hundreds of guests and friends of the university who visit our campus throughout the year. This afternoon is truly one of those very special occasions. Today is my honor and my privilege to welcome all of you to the 44th Annual Edward Surtz Memorial Lecture featuring Robert Alter, who will speak to us about his translation of the Hebrew Bible. Professor Alter is author of more than 20 books and is professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. His work has received numerous awards and recognitions. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress. He is a past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics, recipients of 2 fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, and of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Princeton University, and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. In 2009, he received the Los Angeles Times Robert Kirsch Award for a lifetime contribution to American letters. He has been awarded honorary doctorates by Yale in 2010 and by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 2015. In 2013, he was selected by the American Council of Learned Societies to deliver the Charles Homer Haskin Prize lecture. Professor Alter's presence here today is a sign of encouragement to all of us in attendance. It is no secret that the humanities are under attack on campuses across the country. Many have even gone so far as to question the intrinsic value of a college degree itself. Professor Alter, your scholarship and your dedication to the tried and true values of the Academy, evidenced so poignantly by your books of criticism, translation, and commentary, can be seen as an attempt to put the present generation in touch with its own history, a history which bespeaks of the human narrative as it evolves down through the ages. Whatever one's major or concentration, for over 450 years, Jesuit education has held as a high priority educating the whole person. This goal cannot be achieved if one has no sense where one has come from or of the values that have guided the countless women and men who have blazed this trail before us. The humanities provide the context within which one can both see and appreciate what makes life worth living. In pursuit, there are questions in life that must be seriously studied and grappled with, drawing upon multiple languages, various geographical settings, and numerous historical epochs. These are questions that cannot be resolved simply by asking Siri or Alexa. Today, the challenges to the humanities are fierce. Information is not knowledge, and mere knowledge itself can hardly be equated with wisdom. Professor Alter, thank you for your visit. What you have accomplished throughout your distinguished scholarly career both inspires and encourages all of us to stay the course in humankind's noble pursuit of wisdom. I invite our audience to sit back and savor our time that we have together with one of our nation's best and most prolific scholars, Professor Alter.
Thank you, Father, for your very generous remarks. By the way, I have one personal connection with the Jesuits, which is that the translator, the French translator of my books on biblical narrative and biblical poetry is a Jesuit, Jean-Pierre Sonnet, a lovely man who's now at the Vatican Biblical Institute. When I first met him in Paris, it opened up a new horizon because I realized that if you were a Jesuit, you could be a seriously spiritual person and at the same time incredibly urbane and worldly. But you know all about that, right? Okay. Also, I do appreciate the warm welcome I've experienced here at Loyola, but both this morning in my meeting with graduate students and this afternoon. And I'm very pleased that there's so many students here. I have to confess somewhat an embarrassment that in Berkeley it's hard to get students into visiting lectures. They're focused on their coursework. So it's nice to see that interest here. Now, the obvious question to ask of anyone who sets out to do a translation of the Hebrew Bible is, why would you want to do this? You know, there are countless English versions of the Bible, and in the second half of the 20th century, the various denominations, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, with very learned, high-powered committees, produced their own new translation. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with one or more of those recent English versions. The reason I did it is basically because there's something wrong, even dreadful, about all those versions. The modern versions are the worst sinners. The King James Version has much to recommend it, although there are also problems. Problems beyond the obviously archaic nature of its language after 400 years. So I would like to now. My translation, I guess, is known as a literary translation. That is, I've done my best to find English equivalents for the literary values of the Hebrew, which are quite extraordinary, and I think inseparable from the religious vision of these writers. And the modern translators don't pay any attention to that. That is, the literary dimension of the Bible virtually does not exist for them. You could do a PhD in biblical studies at Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and take all kinds of courses on textual history, on comparative courses, the Bible and Akkadian and so forth. You will never take a course on prose style in the Bible because it doesn't exist. So this is one problem. But beyond that, and this may surprise you, I think there is a real problem of accuracy. I think all of us, even if we've devoted almost no thinking to translation, assume that the first job of a translator is to get all the words right. And that's rather challenging in a language that has not been used for 2.5 millennia. But I think a better job can be done with it than has been. And I'll explain through some examples. But let me just highlight one issue. Biblical narrative is very sparing in its use of words. That is, a story that a novelist would use 150,000 words for is told in a few hundred words, a few hundred extraordinarily well-chosen words, which means that the individual word, and again I'll give some examples, has a weightiness, a saliency that it doesn't quite have in a novel. But even in certain kinds of novels, I would say if you miss certain terms, you miss a lot. Let's take one of the great stylists of the European novel, Gustave Flaubert. Now, Madame Bovary seems to go pretty well in translation. And I would admit that you could read through Madame Bovary, and if here or there there's a word that's mistranslated, it won't affect much your sense of what's going on. But what's more analogous to what happens in the Hebrew Bible is this. In that novel, the word blue, the color blue, not surprisingly, bleu in French, and its derivative bleuâtre, which means something like bluish, recur all over the place. That is, the first time we see Emma Bovary, not yet Bovary, she's holding a blue parasol, and a blue light is cast on her face. Her romantic visions are colored with blue, sort of blue horizons that her dreaming mind drifts off into, and so forth. Now, as far as I know, this is faithfully represented in most translations of Madame Bovary. If you imagine a translator who say, well, it's a little boring, all these repetitions of blue, and given the context of the third occurrence, I'm going to translate it as azure or aquamarine or indigo. By so doing, the translator would destroy a unifying principle in Flaubert's text. And that's what happens again and again in the Hebrew. So let's begin with words. Now, I have to say this. I got very excited about philology as I worked my way through the translation. You know, philology was devised, I think, probably in the early 19th century in German universities for the study of Greek and Latin texts. And it has a lot to do with the reconstruction of texts, the correction of scribal errors, but also simply figuring out exactly what things mean. And I'm going to be very presumptuous sounding and say that the way that biblical scholars do philology leaves something to be desired. This may seem arrogant on my part because my graduate training is in modern literature, comparative literature, and I think I have a very good grasp of biblical Hebrew. I know Aramaic, both biblical Aramaic and rabbinic Aramaic. I can kind of make out Ugaritic, although I never formally studied it, and that's it. You know, unlike the biblical scholars who take courses in Akkadian and Sumerian and Egyptian and detailed work in archaeology and so forth. But there are two problems, I think, with the way they do philology. One is they view the recovery of meanings as principally an establishing of lexical values, which is wrong, because a meaning in a literary text, and these texts are eminently literary, involves nuance, it involves connotation, it involves linguistic register. I'll get to a couple of examples of that. The second problem with the methodology of philology in the PhD programs in Bible is that it doesn't look at the literary context, the narrative context or the poetic context, which often gives you a clue to the meaning of a difficult word or obscure word. So I'll begin with an example like that. In the Samson story, you remember Samson is obliged to invite 30 Philistines men as wedding guests to the 7-day celebration of his nuptials with a Philistine woman. And he makes this wager that if they can solve his riddle, the riddle of out of the strong comes forth sweet, he said, I shall give you 30 fine cloths and 30 chalifot of garments. Now, a chalifa, it comes from the word that means to change, and it clearly means a change of garments. In modern Hebrew, it's come to mean suit, a man's suit, and you can see the connection there. Okay, so the wedding guests coerce Samson's wife into revealing the solution to the riddle. He's outraged. He suspects that they've been fooling around with her. He says, had you not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. And in a rage, he goes down to the city, the Philistine city of Ashdod, I think it's Ashdod, and he went down, Ashkelon. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down from among them 30 men and took their chalitzot. Now you see that word looks like chalifot, but the middle consonant is different. So every translation that I've looked at assumes, well, the wager was for changes of garments. So chalitzot must be another word that means changes of garments. But it doesn't. How do I know? in the whole biblical corpus, and my great friend as a translator is a Hebrew Concordance to the Bible. So that word occurs only in one other story in the whole Bible. That's in 2 Samuel 2. A civil war is raging after the death of Saul between the house of Saul and the house of David. And Saul's savvy, battle-hardened commander is being pursued on the battlefield by Asael, who's described as swift as one of the gazelles of the field. So he knows he cannot run him. He knows he can polish him off if it comes to that. He doesn't want to do this because if he kills him, he rightly assumes that there will be bad blood between him and Asael's brother, who is his counterpart on David's side and is quite a killer, and there will be a vendetta, which is what ensues. So he says to Asael, does Abner, swerve you to your right or your left, and seize for yourself one of the lads, and take you his chalitza. Now, all the modern translations, at least all those I've looked at, thinking of chalitza in the Samson story, say, well, it's a garment. And so they translate it as tunic, garb, garment, even in one translation, belt, although I don't think they wore belts in the ancient year. And I thought that can't be right. And by the way, the one translation that gets it right in Samuel, but not in Judges, is the King James Version. Why does it get it right? Because the King James translators, following the Septuagint, read Homer. And I am a reader of Homer. So I know, as anyone who's gone through the Iliad does, what is it a warrior takes from his slain foe on the battlefield? He doesn't take his belt, he doesn't take his tunic, he takes his armor. You remember the whole thing with Patroclus and taking Achilles' armor. So, once you see, and then it dawned on me that chalitza in this sense must be cognate with the biblical noun chalutz, which means military vanguard. So the chalitza was the special armor worn by the elite fighter in the military vanguard. Now this throws new light on the Samson story. That is, what does he do? The wager has been for garments. He goes down to a Philistine city, Ashkelon, and he kills not 30 ordinary Philistines, but 30 Philistine warriors. And he brings back to the wedding guests something far more valuable than changes of garments, 30 sets of armor, which it's also a warning. You see what I did in Ashkelon. Watch out about what I could do to you. So he's really sticking it to the Philistines, and it's all because of that one word that you see that. Now, a much more compact example, which involves, I know you'll think that this is surprising, sloppiness in construing grammar. God says to Moses at the Sinai Epiphany, I am about to come to you in Av Ha'anan. Now, what is, every translation, including the King James, will say something like, in a thick cloud. But Av doesn't mean thick. There's an almost sounding word, Aveh, which has an additional consonant, the consonant hey, that means thick. But Av occurs mostly in poetry in the Bible, and it also means cloud. So it's sort of like his saying, I am about to come to you in the thunderhead of the cloud. Two different words for cloud. Now, the relation of these two words is what is called in biblical grammar the construct state. That is, two nouns are put together, and the first is of the second, like House of David, which is Beit house, David, with no of. So I've now collected maybe 30 or so examples in the Bible when you have two synonyms put together in the construct state, such as thunderhead of cloud, or also in the Exodus story, there's choshech afela, which is darkness of darkness. So everybody understands that darkness of darkness must mean utter darkness, pitch black. But so here, the Av Ha'anan, I believe, means not an ordinary cloud, such as we see when we look up at the sky, but a kind of super cloud. It's putting two synonyms together is always an intensifier or a superlative. So it's an almost mythic cloud, which is the appropriate vehicle in which God should appear before Moses. So again, the story gets a coloration that it wouldn't have otherwise. Okay, now my next example has to do with connotation. You remember the story that is not read in Sunday schools, where Amnon, lusting after his beautiful half-sister Tamar, follows the advice of a friend, pretends to be ill, and asks her to bring him food into his inner chamber, at which point he seizes her and does the dastardly deed. So his words are as follows. Let Tamar, my sister, pray, come, and tavreni, that's a verb, I'll come back to it, with food, and prepare the biryah, which is cognate to the verb, prepare the biryah before my eyes. Now, there are two words that are commonly used for food in biblical Hebrew. One is ochel, which derives from the word that means to eat. The other is lechem, which means bread, and is synecdoche for all food, which we have in English also, like, I've eaten the king's bread, says Melville's Billy Budd. But this is not, neither of these words is used here. Instead, the word biryah and with the cognate verb is used. All the translations say food. But I said, well, if it were food, the writer would have chosen an ordinary word for food. It must be something with its own nuance. So I turned to my trusty friend, the Hebrew Concordance, and I find that this is a relatively rare word, but in every instance when it's used, it relates to someone, or pertains to someone who has either been doing poorly or has been fasting. So it's perfect. That is, he's pretending that he's doing poorly, and I thought, well, I can't translate this as chicken soup because they hadn't yet domesticated the chicken. So I thought about, and I translated it as nourishment, which gets you some of the connotation of biryah. Now, a different kind of word problem. Nefesh. I may be notorious in some circles that I have removed the English word soul entirely from my translation, S-O-U-L. This is not out of any anti-religious agenda. It's simply the following. The Hebrew writers had no notion of a soul distinct from a body. They had no notion of a body-soul split. It goes along with a well-known fact accepted by biblical scholars that there was no clear sense of an afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, as the eminent British scholar of the Bible, John Barton, said in his latest book. It was a bit like Homer, Homer of either of the epic poems. So, nephesh, the word that is conventionally translated as soul, generally the primary meaning is life breath. You remember God in Genesis 2 breathes the breath of life into the first human. It's probably an onomatopoeic word, nephesh, the breath coming out. By extension, it can mean a person's life, which is understandable. Then it gets extended in a couple of different directions. By metonymy, two terms likened to each other because they're in contact, like Damon Runyon calling a young woman a skirt. By metonymy, nephesh can mean throat or neck, which is the passageway for the life breath. Like, there's a famous error in the King James Version that has been corrected by the moderns, when in Psalms, when the psalmist says in the King James Version, "The waters have come up even into my soul," you wonder, what kind of plumbing is that? Actually, it's an image of drowning. It's the waters have come up to my neck. I'm about to drown, which is much stronger and clearer. So, I'm giving you an extreme example, which might be a little shocking when I tell you what I did with this. In Psalm 63, God, my God, for you I search. My nephesh thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a land waste and parched with no water. Now, everybody, including the moderns, says, my soul thirsts for you. And that's beautiful. I don't for a moment deny its beauty and its spiritual resonance. However, it's not what the psalmist said. Not only because in general there's no term for soul, but look at the context. It's thirst, it's a land waste and parched with no water, and it's in nephesh is in poetic parallelism with flesh. So I think it has the meaning of throat here. And that's how I translated. God, my God, for you I search. My throat thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a land waste and parched with no water. Now, as I say, maybe a little shocked to see my throat thirsts for you. But as I was saying to students this morning, one of the hallmarks of the expression of spirituality in the Hebrew Bible is that it's anchored in the Bible, in the body. And here you have an instance where the speaker is so desperate to come in contact with God that his throat thirsts for God, like somebody who's dying of thirst in a dry desert. So it has its own poetic power, which is different from the soul power. Okay, Now, about rhythm. As far as I know, no literary prose worth looking at or listening to lacks rhythm. That is, we all expect rhythm in poetry, and various fumbling attempts have been made, which I try to improve on, to get the rhythms of Hebrew verse into English. But people don't think about that in connection with the prose. But in fact, it's very important. And I'm going to give you just one very compact example. And God made these translations are all mine. And God made the two great lights, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. Now, when I put that down without thinking. This is right at the beginning. You see chapter 1 of my enterprise. Then I stopped and I said, why did I do that? Why dominion? Especially since I tried to avoid Latinate terms. And the first thing I thought of was, well, everyone translates it as an infinitive, to rule over, to govern, or the worst of all is the Jewish Publication Society, which has to dominate the day, to dominate the night. And that shows a tin ear for English. That is, the Soviet Union dominated the smaller states of Eastern Europe after World War II. But you don't have the sun and the moon dominating the day and the night. But then I realized that for me there was a more compelling reason, which I had replicated the cadence of the Hebrew. And now I'll recite the Hebrew for a minute, just the last phrase. Et ha'ma'or ha'gadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or ha'katon lememshelet halayla, v'et ha'kochavim. Now, if you listen to mine, you see that it's pretty much the same cadence. The great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. Well, why is this important, you might ask yourself? That is, it's just a literary guy fooling around with sounds. It doesn't tell us anything about the meaning of the Bible. I think it does, because you can't separate rhythm, among other features, from meaning. Now, this is part of the priestly narrative, the so-called P version of creation. And the priestly writer, quite different from the next writer, who's actually the earlier one, J, has this grand sense of choreographed order in the creation of the world. One thing follows another in an ordered succession. The harmony reigns in God's creation. And subliminally, the beautiful cadence of this sentence transmits to us a signal of harmony and order. And you lose something if you lose the rhythm. Okay, now I won't take too much time with this next example, but run through it quickly. The parable, Nathan the prophet's parable of the poor man's E-W-E, which he uses to lead David on and then to snap the rhetorical trap shut on him. It's like the play's the thing that wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Here's the parable's the thing. Okay, so it reads like this in my translation. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured her and raised her with him together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, and she was to him like a daughter. Now, I'm sure almost no reader will pay attention to this or notice it, but I was very proud of that when I translated. I'll tell you why. This passage, the parable, is marked off from the surrounding narrative, in part by its vocabulary. There are 3 words here that don't appear elsewhere, but even more by its rhythm. It's a kind of sing-song rhythm, because it's the never, never land of parables. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich, the other poor. And the Hebrew, Shnei anashim hayu be'ir echad ashir v'echad rash, like that. Now, why is that important? It's important because a signal was given to the audience that this is a parable. But David does not get it. He thinks it's a real legal case, and he expresses indignation at what this man has done, to which Nathan responds famously, "You are the man." It's a just wonderful moment in the story. Well, so the rhythm, you see, which is unlike the rhythms of the surrounding narrative, is very important. And there's one sentence I felt very happy about. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, and she was to him like a daughter. Now, you might notice that daughter, I couldn't do anything else in English, but apart from that, every single word in that sentence is a monosyllable, like the Hebrew. And the words for crust, cup, and lap are pat, kos, chek. So, the King James translators almost got it, but when they got to lap, they translated it as bosom. And they blew it. Yeah. Okay? So, let's proceed. Now, word order, that is syntax. Okay, biblical syntax is rather different from modern English, and some of it you just have to not pay attention to, because it's the normal Hebrew word order and it's abnormal in English. Like if one were to follow the syntax of the first line of Genesis, it would come out as in the beginning created God the world, which is silly. Yeah, and a cardinal rule for me is never do it if it's silly. But there's a lot of syntactic inversion in the Bible. Biblical Hebrew lends itself more to that than modern English, but some of it is very pointed. And I always tried to represent the pointed inversion. So when Jacob's sons come back to him from their first journey to Egypt, and they tell him that the man who rules over all of Egypt, because they don't know it's their brother, has taken Simeon as a hostage and won't see their faces again unless they bring down Benjamin, his full brother. Jacob responds in the following way: "Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take. It is I who bear it all." Now, me you have bereaved. This is a blatant inversion. It's blatant in the Hebrew too. That is, the normal way you say in biblical Hebrew, "You have bereaved me," is to take the verb that means to bereave and tack on to the end of it an accusative suffix that means me. It would come out as one word, shikaltuni. But he doesn't say shikaltuni, he says, oti shikaltem. In other words, the writer has broken out the me from the verb and stuck it at the beginning of Jacob's speech. I think that the reason that he has done this is quite pointed. That is, in my reading of the Jacob story, old Jacob, from the time of Joseph's purported death, has become a kind of prima donna of paternal grief. He's always playing that role. It is I who bear it all at the end of this little speech. And therefore, it's a significant reflection of his character that is me you have bereaved. The modern translation says something, it is I whom you have bereaved, and that's a little too formal, and it doesn't get the shock effect of me you have bereaved. Now, some skeptics may say, well, that's all very well, but in fact, we don't tolerate much inversion now in English. But I think we do, especially if we read back just maybe a century and a half to earlier English poetry, which most of us still read in school. It's full of inversion. It changed after the modernist revolution in poetry. So, for example, Keats's famous sonnet, which is an old chestnut in school textbooks, his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, "Much have I traveled in the realms of gold." So that's an inversion just like me you have bereaved. And I think that there's a certain advantage in giving the language a coloration that is slightly older than the English we use now. Not to make it face forced archaism, but also to avoid making it sound as though it were written today. Okay, now a different example of what linguists call fronting of a word that wouldn't normally be fronted. Isaiah's prophecy begins, "Sons I have nurtured and raised, but they rebelled against me." So you see, it's similar with a different point. That is, the sons are put up front by the prophet, emphasizing their filial relation to God and how shocking it is that they should have rebelled against him. And let me see. I think that that is my last illustration. I'll just add the following for a couple of minutes. I said before that single word choices carry great weight in the Bible, both in the poetry and in the narrative prose. And I will give you two examples, brief ones, for the narrative prose. In the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, we're told 3 or 4 times at the beginning of the story, it's said of Potiphar, and all that he had, he left in Joseph's hands. The Hebrew actually, it was a little bit better in Joseph's hand, singular, but I thought that English idiom required the plural hands. Now, of course, we all understand to leave something in somebody's hands is to leave it in his trust. Right? It's a kind of half-dead metaphor. or maybe an entirely dead metaphor. The moderns tend to translate it left in Joseph's trust, left under Joseph's supervision, and worse and worse. But at the climax of this very story, when Lady Potiphar tries to assault Joseph, she grabs his tunic, he yanks away, presumably has nothing on under it. Egypt is a hot country, and runs outside. And he left his garment in her hand. The very same phrase that's been used metaphorically is now used literally. Then, when she tries to frame Joseph and claim that he attempted to rape her, she says 3 times, twice to the, at least twice. She says it to the household servants and then to her husband. And he left his garment by me and fled outside. The by me substituted for in her hand, and that's the crucial piece of evidence, the evidence for her that testifies to her lie, because by me means that he took it off himself, preparatory to rape. Okay, one last example. Well, okay, another couple of short examples. There's a matter of boldness in word choice. So in the story of the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, she has a water supply and a water skin with her. They're out under the blazing sun in the desert, and the water runs out. So she's positive that within a matter of hours, maybe minutes, her only son is going to die. And she rushes off to the distance of a bow shot so that she won't have to look when the child dies. But what does she do beforehand? She takes him, and the Hebrew word is vatashlichenu, it's a verb, under one of the bushes. So survey the translations, you will see. She placed him under one of the bushes. She set him under one of the bushes. She put him under one of the bushes. King James Version is a little bit better, but it's not, doesn't go all the way. She said she thrust him under one of the bushes. However, this is one of those biblical words that has a single meaning whenever it appears, which is to fling. It's the same word that's used when Pharaoh says to the Egyptians, every male child you shall fling into the Nile, the flinging of babies. So what's going on? I think that the writer is being a lot bolder than his translators. That what he sees is that this desperate woman, convinced that her child is about to die, in a paroxysm of maternal grief, flings the child down and then rushes off. And you have to have as much guts as the writer does to be faithful to what the writer wanted to achieve. Okay, one final example, which has to do with the general phenomenon of metaphor. The modern versions, King James Version is better, but not invariably so, make an astounding assumption that modern readers cannot understand metaphors. So what do? in the overwhelming instances, they substitute for the metaphor what they think the metaphor refers to, which I think is a fatal translator's error. And okay, I'll give one example from Genesis and one from Qohelet, Ecclesiastes, and then hold my peace. In Genesis, when Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt the first time, he, remembering how they threw him into the pit, he angrily says to them, in my version, which follows both the word order and the language, the metaphorical language of the Hebrew, to see the nakedness of the land you have come. Now, what you find in a few prominent modern translations by committee is that they say something like, you've come to spy out the weak points in our defense, which is what they think. They may be right, they may be wrong, that what they think nakedness of the land is. However, nakedness of the land is a very fraught, to see the nakedness, is a very fraught idiom in biblical Hebrew. To see nakedness is what you repeatedly find in taboo of forbidden sexual relationships, especially incest relationships. You know, you shall not see your mother's nakedness. Since we understand by extension or metonymy that to see the nakedness is involved in everything else in the acts of sex, the act of sex. So this is a very potent metaphor. It means that something that's absolutely forbidden, that no alien eyes should ever behold, you've come down to see. And that's, I think, why he said the writer chooses to give to Joseph the word to see the nakedness rather than to spy or some similar term. And all that evaporates when you delete the metaphor. Now, finally, I want to take the example of, I will call it Qohelet, as biblical scholars now do. That's the Hebrew title. It's the name of the speaker in the poem. Whether it's a title or not has been disputed, but we won't get into that. Now, and it's traditionally called Ecclesiastes, which is a mouthful and makes it sound a little too churchy, I think. So, like as in ecclesiastical. So, Qohelet is the closest thing to a philosophic text in the Hebrew Bible. It's not systematic philosophy, but it ponders such questions as the nature of existence, the nature of history, the nature of human endeavor, and so forth. But, and by the way, some scholars think that since it's a late text, sometime in the 4th century BCE, maybe it was influenced by Greek philosophy. It's a possibility, but not a sure thing. Now, what Qohelet does is repeatedly to use metaphors where we would use an abstract term. And you should keep in mind that biblical Hebrew is rather poor in abstractions. In fact, a full set of abstractions don't enter Hebrew until the Middle Ages, when the Arabic philosophic texts of Maimonides and Ibn Gabirol and others were translated from Arabic, in which they wrote, into Hebrew. So, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher in the King James Version. Well, that's, of course, the King James Version means vanity not in the sense of someone primping in front of a mirror, but things that are vain, that are empty, which is not a bad equivalent of the meaning, but not of the force of the Hebrew term. The moderns, some of them translate futility or absurdity or whatever, all of which are partly cover what the Hebrew does. But you see, the advantage of a metaphor is that it can cover more ground than a single abstract term. It can invoke a set of overlapping terms. That's one advantage. The second advantage, it has a punch because of its concreteness that the abstract term doesn't have. So what does Qohelet say in the Hebrew, which I replicate in the Hebrew? Breath, merest breath, said Qohelet. All is mere breath and herding the wind. Okay, let me parse that for a minute, and then I'll take some time for your questions. As in many languages, spiritus in Latin is another example, a single word, ruach, means two or three things. It can mean wind, it can mean spirit, it can mean breath. I think actually in the first chapter of Genesis, it probably means that God's breath is hovering over the face of the waters. So here, I'm convinced it means wind. And the other word, which is translated as vexation, because they construe the wrong Hebrew root here, is from the Hebrew verbal stem that clearly means to herd, as to herd animals. So all is mere breath herding the wind. That should stop you cold. You couldn't find a more resonant expression for futility than trying to herd the wind. As I said, this one is like our expression herding cats, but it's 1 degree higher in intensity. So I hope these sundry examples have given you some preliminary sense of why I set out on this quixotic task of doing a new translation of the Bible, why I think that there are many things that are lost if you don't attend to what the words really mean, and also in the way the words are ordered. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. As I'm an English PhD student here, so your discussion of prosody and rhythm was like so exciting for me. But one particular question I had is that you mentioned that you tried not to incorporate many Latin
Right.
And so I guess I'm just wondering about that decision of why you chose to keep the like the lexical register at a different level. And I guess I'm just I wonder what went into that decision, and then what strategies did you have to use to find sufficient words that did not push themselves into the future of having Latinate or romantic influence, but were still able to convey things in the way that you wanted them to be expressed.
Okay. Now, first thing is this. I guess there are two reasons why I mostly, not in all cases, I mostly steered away from Latinate words. One is that in English, those words reflect a more formal register of the language than do words of Anglo-Saxon origin. So, for example, we have conflagration and fire. And no one in his right mind or her right mind would say, there's a conflagration in City Hall, right? There's a fire in City Hall. And especially the way biblical narrative is written, they always opted for fire and not conflagration. So that's one thing. Then, of course, there's the matter of sound. And again, fire conflagration is a good analogy. That there aren't a lot of polysyllabic words in biblical Hebrew. It's very compact. That's what generate the compact cadences in the prose and the forcefully compact rhythms of the poetry. So you can get at it much better by favoring the short, ordinary words that you have in the Anglo-Saxon stratum of the language. One British reviewer, I think it was in the Times of London, not of the big 3-volume set, but I think it was of the 5 Books of Moses, who liked the translation, said that he admired it because it took us back to the Anglo-Saxon matrix of English literature. I was very happy with that comment. Now, how I go about finding these words, mostly I search through the dictionary or the thesaurus in my head. And sometimes it doesn't occur to me right away. And not all these words are Anglo-Saxon, most of them are. For example, when David is fleeing from Absalom, and the Henry Kissinger in his court has gone over to Absalom. There's a guy named Achitophel, and David in his flight prays a very short prayer. He says, God, and then he used the word that means to overthrow, overturn, and all of a sudden I thought of thwart. God thwart the counsel of Achitophel. I felt happy about that. Then there's no iniquity in my translation, because I don't like the sound of it, and it is quite Latinate. And usually it's the equivalent used for a 2-syllable Hebrew word avon, which is still quite compact. And so I thought that, especially because a lot of the contexts in which avon is used, even though the argument is spiritual, there's a kind of legal context there's fundamental violation of the law and what's going on. So I translate it as crime. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
Let him bring the mic over.
Yeah, I'm wondering. Your early career was as a Stendhal and fielding expert, and then you get into this, which seems to be like you were born for it. Was there a moment, or was there what clicked to send you in this path?
This is a story I'm afraid I've told publicly a few times, but I'll give you a short version. I always loved the Bible, and I knew biblical Hebrew quite well since I was 18 or 19. I had no handle on what was so great about it, especially the narrative, because it seemed so simple in a certain way. And then I began to think, well, I have the tools. After 15 years in the profession, and I've written a lot about fiction, I think I have the tools to begin to explain the greatness of biblical narrative. So I wrote one kind of polemic article highlighting the importance of a literary perspective, and thought that would be it, but then there was a big response to it, and I wrote another article, and soon I was in the middle of writing a book on biblical narrative, and that was the turning point.
One here, then I have one over here. And one over here.
What do you think of the work of Everett Fox?
I think it is a noble endeavor, and I've been in cordial exchange with Everett Fox by email. I met him once, and we got on fine. I think it's a noble endeavor, but which overlaps with what I'm trying to do in one fundamental regard, but I think that it doesn't quite work. The nobility of the endeavor is this. He wants to clear the playing field entirely, and to, as some of you may know, he's following the model of Buber and Rosenzweig with their German translation of the Bible, and he wants to make the Hebrewness of the Hebrew evident all along the way. Now, I sympathize with that goal, and to some extent, I try to do that too. But here's my big reservation. In order to do that, Everett Fox uses some pretty strange English, as you know. And the Hebrew is never strange. As far as we can tell, these writers had idiomatic perfect pitch in their own language, and it's reflected in their writing. So I think that to the extent that you translate into an English that doesn't always sound like English, you're actually, with all your aspiration to fidelity, you're betraying the original. For example, this is an unfortunate case where translators are stumped. In the last half of the Ten Commandments, there's a series of "you shall not," which usually those are just 3 syllables in the Hebrew. There's al, which means not, and then the verb, and the verb is usually 2 syllables. So it's al tignov, you shall not steal. Al titzach, you shall not murder. It doesn't mean kill. Al tinaf, and it's lo, I'm sorry. Lo tignov, there are 2, my apologies. Lo tignov, you shall not steal. And then lo tinaf, you shall not commit adultery. Now that is a pain in English, because that's the only way to say it in English. You have to say commit adultery. There's no simple intransitive verb, as far as I know, but you shall not play around. It's hard. It's very hard. So Everett Fox wanted to at least cut it short. So he says, he throws out the commit, and he says, you shall not adulter. But that's not English. So that's, and then, now, here's one where I think he recanted when he revised. At the beginning, in his first published 5 books of Moses, the simple Hebrew word mizbeach, which means altar, he translated as slaughter site. Now, why did he do that? Because following Buber Rosenzweig, he wanted to make the root meaning of the verb in Hebrew from which the word altar is derived, which means to slaughter. He wanted to make it transparent in English, so he invented this term slaughter site. But slaughter site isn't an English word. Moreover, I don't think the ancient Hebrew thought of slaughter every time he or she heard the word mizbeach, altar. And one piece of evidence for it is that there's a particular altar, Mizbach HaNechoshet, the brass altar, which on which incense is offered. No slaughter involved at all. So that's my big reservation about his work.
I have 3 people marked, so I think that'll take us to time. So here's person number 1, sir.
Thank you. One of the most puzzling, if not shocking, statements in the New Testament by Jesus is that unless you hate your mother and your brother and your sister, etc., you cannot be my disciple. Is there anything in the Old Testament that sheds light on what he really meant by hate?
No, not really. I think it comes from the very different religious context in which Jesus operated, which is more like the context of the Dead Sea sectarians, where you form a religiously devoted community that follows a spiritual leader, and there's nothing quite like that in the Hebrew Bible.
Thank you very much. This is a question like Fox. I confess that before I came here, I reread The Art of Biblical Narrative. So I came across Benjamin Harshaf.
Pardon me?
Benjamin Harshaf.
Oh, yes. He was a good friend of mine. Yeah. Now, what are you asking about Benjamin Harshaf?
Do you still find him useful as a prosodist?
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if you could say something
Okay. Benjamin Harshaf, for the general audience, was born, I think, in 1928 in Vilnius, in a home where Yiddish was the first language, but his father was also dedicated to Hebrew. The family, when Benjamin was, I guess, around 11, when the Nazis moved into Lithuania, the family fled into central Russia. So he was raised in or educated formally in Russian. Then he made his way illegally across borders to Palestine just as the new state was declared, and functioned in Hebrew there until at a certain point in mid-career he was offered a professorship at Yale and moved to Yale. So he knew many languages, thank you, very well. He was also a very brilliant person. I think I would rate him as maybe one of the 2 or 3 most brilliant people I've encountered in academic life. And he wasn't a Bible scholar, but he was interested in the historical development of Hebrew prosody, in Hebrew poetry, from the Bible to the 20th century. So he wrote what was first a long encyclopedia article on this topic, which was already very original, and late in life he expanded it into a book which is available both in English and in Hebrew on I forget what it's called, the history of poetic form or something in Hebrew. And although, as I say, he was not a Bible scholar, I think with his commanding knowledge of how poetry is constructed, he managed to come up with a proposal for explaining how poetic parallelism worked in the Bible, which I think was far more sophisticated and appropriately flexible than anything circulating among Bible scholars. And it's as following. It's been conventional since the lectures on biblical poetry of Bishop Loth in the 18th century to observe that biblical poetry is based on semantic parallelism between the two halves of the line. What Benjamin showed was that there are 3 elements of parallelism. There's meaning, there's rhythm, which means the number of beats of accented syllables in each half of the line, and then there's syntax. And he observed that there was a good deal of flexibility, that a line of biblical poetry could exhibit all 3 elements simultaneously, as in one of the first lines of poetry in the Bible, Lamech's vengeance chant, in which the first line sounds like this: Ada and Silla, listen to my voice. O wives of Lamech, hear my utterance. So you see, every term is parallel in meaning and also in its syntactic position, and you can take my word for it, the same number of beats in each half of the Hebrew line. But it doesn't have to be that way, and there's this interesting flexibility, just as in blank verse in English, you have many great poets who compose, including Shakespeare, who compose thousands of lines which are not quite iambic pentameter. So I think he's very useful.
We have one more person. I don't want to encroach anybody's time, but could we be efficient about it? It's Dr. Hopper here. Would you like to put Hilla?
One quick question.
Sure.
So, talking about Berosenzweig, I don't think that from today's perspective, any translation can be read innocently from, especially from a Christian perspective, where I come from, and the Berosenzweig translation is the best example of it, because it was an effort in the German language to show the
Yes,
Jewish
I
tradition
understand
within
that
the
about Buber Road.
overwhelmingly Christianized German language. And my question to you is doing something similar with the English language. Do you have what is your position on the innocence or non-innocence of any translation of the Hebrew Bible in 2020 or at the beginning of the 21st century, meaning after the Shoah?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, of course, no translator can entirely rid himself or herself of the translator's personal biases. So I admit that straight out. But I would say that I've done my strenuous best not to translate out of my personal biases, but out of my understanding of what the original meanings and the historical resonances of the Hebrew were. And I did not have an agenda, which of course in a way Buber and Rosenzweig did, of scrubbing the Hebrew Bible clean of Christianity. But I did have an agenda of trying to get back to what it meant to the original writers, which had the effect of eliminating the Christian overlay. And I'll give you one example. The 23rd Psalm, which probably quite a few people in this room know by heart, if from nowhere else, all those 30s Hollywood films where there's a deathbed scene and somebody is reciting the 23rd Psalm. So, thou, and of course always in the King James Version. So, thou restoreth my soul. Okay, you can guess, there's no soul, so I think I said, you revive my life. But more strategic in a poem are two small choices. Thou anointest my head with oil. Now, the modern translations all say you anointed my head with oil. And they're wrong. I'm absolutely convinced they're wrong. Why? Not because I have any theological bias against anointment. It's because the Hebrew verb that's used here does not mean to anoint. That is, there's only one verb in the Bible that means to anoint. It's the verb mashach, from which we get Mashiach, Messiah, the anointed one. And that verb is specialized for two contexts. One is the anointing of kings. The other is the consecration of the high priest. So there's an overlap between the two when you have messianic conceptions of the king. The Hebrew verb here is related to a root that means luxuriant. So you couldn't translate it this way, but literally it means that you make my head luxuriant with oil. I ended up settling for a compromise. You moisten my head with oil. What the verb means is, think of the Odyssey. A wayfarer comes in and he's welcomed as a guest, and they bathe his feet as they do with strangers in Genesis, and rub him with olive oil. It's part of the good life. It's what you see in Bed Bath and Beyond and so forth. So it's it's a this worldly term. It doesn't imply consecration as the verb cognate with Messiah does, but it suggests that what it's saying is that God, you make me feel good. You provide for all my needs here and now in this world. And then at the end of the psalm, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The catch is that the Hebrew doesn't say forever. The Hebrew says, Lo'orech yamim. There are 3 or 4 biblical terms for forever, but it's not used here. Lo'orech yamim means literally for a length of days, because you can't translate it that way. I translate for many long days. So what's the difference? The difference is as follows. If the speaker prays to dwell in the house of the Lord forever, then the house of the Lord could only be the house of the Lord in heaven. But what the speaker is talking about, the house of the Lord is the temple. And he says, what I want to do after you anoint my head with oil and lay out a feast before me is to hang around in the temple precincts for years, to hear the beautiful chanting of the Levites, to smell the incense offered up with the sacrifices, and so forth. So the whole expression of dedication to and trust in God is given a this worldly framework, which is quite unlike the Christian one, just by the shift of 3 terms.
Thank you. We must bring this conversation to an end now. There is a reception. I invite you to stick around to shift into an informal conversation. Please join me now in thanking Professor Mother.